Welcome back to Faith in Question. I'm your host Rob, and today we're going to be exploring a very familiar story in the Bible. You may know it as Noah's Ark or the flood, but if you're watching this channel, I suspect you already are very familiar with this story. This video is for those who look at the Bible and read it literally, as the inspired word of God, where every word is true and every word has to be historically accurate. And so I want to explore that today, explore this story, let's take another look at it, see what it actually says, and start to look at some of the other scientific evidence that's out there as well that can help us to glean information about this story and whether or not it actually happened. If I was just making this story up and I told you that there was going to be a 600-year-old man who builds a boat with his 3 sons, it already starts to border on absurdity just with that claim alone. But then there's also some very basic high-level questions that people can ask that are sometimes quite a bit humorous that just start to make you wonder and think on how was this even possible? For instance, let's think about anteaters. They eat about 30,000 ants and termites per day. So how were we supposed to get enough ants and termites on the boat to be able to make sure the anteaters had over 2 million ants and termites to eat during their stay on the boat? It starts to become a bit problematic. Or another one, how do you get animals from isolated regions around the earth, such as the kangaroos from Australia or the llamas from South America? How about the dragons from Komodo? How do we get them from those locations to the Ark, and then somehow they're back in those same locations where they've always been without leaving any kind of fossil evidence along the way? We only find them in those same locations today. So there's a bunch of really easy things we can bring to light that start to call this story into question. But what I want to do today is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the 5 biggest pieces of evidence that we have from science that we can use to look at this story and start to draw the conclusion about whether or not this actually happened. Reason number 1 is the geological evidence. If there were a global flood, we would expect to see a worldwide layer of sediment that was laid at the exact same time. But that's not what we find. Instead, we find that Earth's sedimentary rocks were actually laid slowly over millions of years. For instance, we can take a look at the Grand Canyon, and we've all seen the distinct layers that were each representing a different period in time. These layers are undisturbed and neatly ordered, reflecting gradual processes, like rivers, seas, deserts, but not a chaotic flood event. Next, we can look at the fossil record. Fossils are organized in a clear chronological order, from simple marine life in the lowest layers all the way up to complex mammals in the higher layers. Now, if there were a global flood, those layers would be absolutely mixed up and all over the place. But again, that's not what we find. All over the world, these layers follow the same exact order for the same time periods. So if there's no sedimentary evidence and no evidence within the fossil record, how could this flood have been a global, worldwide, catastrophic event? We would see some evidence of that today. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is genetic evidence. If humanity was reduced to just Noah's family all the way back in 2500 BC, if we fast forward to today, 4,500 years later, we would see evidence of that. There would be a giant bottleneck in our DNA, but that's not what we observe. Studies of mitochondrial DNA show a steady and continuous growth in the human population for tens of thousands of years. When we look across the world, we see no evidence of a severe bottleneck just 4,500 years ago. And then you have the whole issue of inbreeding. If all humans in the world descended from just those 8 people, we would see signs of this, like disease and mutations, but instead, our genetic diversity suggests a much longer history. So there is nothing that we have that points to evidence that all of the descendants of the world came from Noah and his family. So that's reason number 2. For reason number 3, we'll just take a look at history to be able to see that there were ancient civilizations that were ongoing in 2500 BC, and there's no evidence that they had any issues during that period of time. Now, many of these civilizations had written records and advanced architecture, as well as continuous cultural development. Egypt is the first example. The Old Kingdom would have been in full swing during this time period. They were building pyramids. They were documenting much about their lives in hieroglyphics. And yet there's no mention of a catastrophic flood that destroyed their society. Then we can also look at the Sumerians, further to the north. They were building cities during this period of time and developing math and writing. And we have many cuneiform records from them that show that there was no break in their civilization during this period of time. We also have the people in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan who were flourishing during this same period of time. Again, there's no break in their written history. So if a global flood occurred, it would have destroyed all 3 of these civilizations, and I've not yet heard anyone give me a plausible answer as to how they could have survived and this story still be true. Now, for number 4, we're going to talk all about water, and this is an interesting one because we already talked about in our introduction that this water would have had to cover the top of Mount Everest and have covered 15 cubits above Mount Everest. Now, things start to get a little bit interesting if we do the math around this calculation of the surface of the Earth and the height of Mount Everest and how much water would it actually take to be able to cover the top of Mount Everest. Well, this is a simple math equation, and we can look at volume. Volume is going to be the surface area times the height, and we can run this calculation using the numbers from the Earth to see exactly what we'll come up with. So we know that it would take 4.51 cubic kilometers of water to be able to have a flood big enough to cover the top of Mount Everest. Now, that's a lot of water, so what's the problem? Well, you see, scientists have gone and actually measured the estimated total amount of water that exists everywhere on Earth. Everywhere. That's our oceans, the ice caps, rivers, lakes, groundwater, and the atmosphere. And they found that the total amount of water in our entire system is about 1.386 cubic kilometers of water. Now, to cover Mount Everest, we need 4.5. We're at 1.3. So there's literally only enough water in the entire world to get about a third of the height up of Mount Everest. We would need 3 times the amount of water to be able to cover Mount Everest. That's a real problem. But let's just say that it was possible. Let's say that there was enough water to be able to make that happen. Well, we have another problem because we have to think about how much does it have to rain to be able to cover Mount Everest? Well, again, this is a simple math equation. We can do the math and find out exactly how fast it would have to rain because the Bible says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. That's very specific. And we know that Mount Everest is 29,000 feet tall. Now, I'm not so good at math, so I plugged this one into ChatGPT just to make it really easy for me. And the answer it gave me back was that we would need approximately 363 inches of rain per hour to be able to get enough water in 40 days and 40 nights to cover Mount Everest. 363 inches of rain per hour. Have you ever seen it rain 1 inch per hour? I mean, that is heavy. When we look across the world, the heaviest rain we've ever recorded is 15 inches per hour. So we're talking over 20 times that. 20 times 15 inches per hour to be able to rain hard enough, to be able to rain enough, to be able to cover Mount Everest. That's the problem with water, and that's number 4. And then for number 5, we're going to talk about the logistics of trying to be able to make all of this stuff work. The logistics of housing and feeding millions of species that would have been on the ark. Now, I'm no expert in zoology, but just like humans, animals all have very specific dietary needs and very specific conditions that must be met for them to be able to live and live optimally. How did Noah and his family ensure that the carnivores had meat to eat? How did they make sure that the plant eaters had fresh plants to be able to eat? And then how did 8 people care for millions of species on a daily basis? It is really hard to make that math work. Now, Kent Hovind and Ken Ham have a lot to say about this in terms of how they make the story work for fundamentalists. As a matter of fact, Answers in Genesis actually says that it wasn't millions of species. It must have only been about 16,000 animals that would have been on the ark, because they say that's every kind. And later on, when the kinds get off the boat, they can go ahead and reproduce, and we can see this speciation happen over time. Well, I don't think that that works, but let's just pretend that it does. So we still have 16,000 animals on the ark. So if we take the 8 people that are on the boat and the 16,000 animals, well, each person gets to take care of 2,000 animals per day. How does that sound to you? Do you know how much waste is produced by 16,000 animals in a day? Well, luckily, Answers in Genesis has thought about this, and they've given us an answer. It would have been about 12 tons of animal shit every single day that had to be removed from the ark. 12 tons. That would be a full-time job in and of itself for 8 people to be able to remove that. Oh, by the way, where is it supposed to go? There's only one window. God shut the door. The window is only 18 inches tall. So how are we supposed to get all the waste out of this boat from all these animals, 12 tons of it? So that's a big problem. And there are other issues as well in terms of different animals from different climates that need to have different climates available. Did they have a climate control system on this boat? What about ventilation? The ark was supposed to be 3 layers tall. Only had one window. How are they making sure that the animals that are on the bottom aren't being killed with methane poisoning? Now, Answers in Genesis has answers to all of these. I've been on their website. I'll post the article into the notes here for the show, so you can go look at it for yourself. They have come up with all kinds of possibilities of how ventilation systems could have existed back then. They maybe even had a piping system for water for all these animals. So many different things that are there. I find it very interesting. We're just going off what the Bible actually says, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so that's number 5. The inconsistencies that make it nearly impossible for this to logistically to have happened. So we have geology, we have genetics, we have archaeology, we have hydrology, and just common sense logistics that make it very difficult for this story to have been true, and certainly impossible for it to have happened in 2500 BC. So what are we supposed to do with this story? There's a bunch of evidence that exists that points to this not being a story that's believable. Since the Bible was written, it was really easy to take this at face value. Science had not progressed anywhere near far enough to be able to really start to refute some of the claims that are made in the Bible. But now, in the last 200 years, we have made great strides in geology and in archaeology and in other areas of study that make it clear for us to understand that some of these things simply aren't possible, and the evidence is mounting up against what happens to be a very ancient text. This has been another episode of Faith in Question. We'll see you next time.